The man who built the world's most peaceful religious monument seized power by jumping onto his great-uncle's war elephant during battle and killing him. That's not a legend. That's not mythology. That's a historical fact, carved into a stone stele recovered from Laos. The killer's name was Jayavarman II, and what he built after that bloody coup would require more stone than every Egyptian pyramid combined. But here's what almost nobody knew until the year 2012. The temple you can see was just the beginning. Hidden beneath Cambodia's jungle was an entire city, bigger than modern-day Los Angeles. A megalopolis that 150 years of archaeology completely missed. If you're intrigued by this journey through a lost empire revealed, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to discover. Let me paint you a picture of what Jayavarman II commanded. 5 to 10 million sandstone blocks, each one weighing up to 1,500 pounds. More stone than every Egyptian pyramid put together. And those stones didn't come from nearby. They came from quarries 25 miles away. To move them, he mobilized 300,000 workers, 6,000 elephants, and it took somewhere between 30 and 37 years of continuous construction. Think about that for a moment. 300,000 people. That's more than the entire population of most medieval cities, all working on a single building project for nearly 4 decades. The temple they built, Angkor Wat, covers 163 hectares. That's 400 acres. Its moat alone is 650 feet wide and runs for more than 3 miles, holding water 13 feet deep. The moat is larger than many medieval cities. And here's something strange, something that archaeologists noticed, but that most visitors never think about. Angkor Wat faces west. That might not sound significant, but in Hindu culture, west is the direction of death. Virtually every other Khmer temple faces east, toward the rising sun, toward life, but not this one. This one faces toward the sunset, toward the end. Even the bas reliefs, those continuous stone carvings that run for more than 500 meters along the gallery walls, they proceed counterclockwise, the direction used for funeral rites. Jayavarman II wasn't just building a temple. He was building his tomb, the most elaborate mausoleum in human history. A monument so perfect, so precise, that the stones fit together without mortar, their joints almost invisible. Modern estimates suggest that building Angkor Wat with current technology would take 300 years. He did it in 37, with ropes and elephants, and the absolute authority of a god king. But he never saw it finished. Around the year 1150, Jayavarman II died, probably during military campaigns against the kingdom of Champa. He spent his entire reign building his eternal resting place, and he died before seeing it completed. That's the visible story. The temple, standing in the clearing, the tourist photographs, the sunrise over the reflecting pool. But in 2012, something extraordinary happened. A team of archaeologists flew helicopters over Cambodia's jungles, carrying a piece of technology that would change everything we thought we knew about this place. It's called LiDAR, light detection and ranging. Imagine millions of laser pulses firing downward every few seconds. Most of them bounce off leaves and branches, but a small percentage, maybe 5%, slit through gaps in the canopy and hit the ground. And those that hit the ground reveal something remarkable. They reveal the shape of the earth beneath the jungle. What those lasers found made archaeologists dizzy with excitement. One of them, Roland Fletcher from the University of Sydney, called it embarrassingly exciting, because what they discovered was this: Everything they'd been studying for 150 years was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath that jungle canopy lay over 1,000 square kilometers of urban landscape, roads laid out in precise grids, canals and reservoirs, neighborhoods, entire cities, temples they'd walked past for decades without knowing they were there. Greater Angkor, they now know, was larger than any medieval city anywhere in the world, bigger than anything in China, bigger than anything in Europe. At its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries, it supported somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million people. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of modern-day Los Angeles, except this city existed in the 12th century, built without machinery, without engines, without any of the technologies we assume are necessary for urban sprawl. Roland Fletcher, one of the lead researchers, put it this way: there was nothing like Greater Angkor until the advent of 19th century industrial cities. And for more than a century, archaeologists had no idea. They'd been studying Angkor since the 1860s. They'd mapped the major temples. They'd documented the inscriptions. They'd measured every visible stone, but they'd missed 90% of the city because it was hiding in plain sight, under ferns and vines and massive trees whose roots wrapped around ancient foundations. The jungle had swallowed it so completely that you could walk directly over a medieval road network and have no idea it was beneath your feet. Damien Evans, the archaeologist who led the LiDAR surveys, described the moment when a city appeared on his screen. They'd been searching for years on foot near a temple called Preah Khan, about 60 miles from Angkor, searching for evidence of urban settlements. 10 years of searching. Then the LiDAR data came through. All of a sudden, he said, the city has more or less instantly appeared on the screen in front of us. 10 years of searching on the ground. And then, in an instant, there it was. Entire city blocks, roads, water systems, everything. This is the story we're going to explore tonight. Not just the temple that stands in the clearing, but the empire it represented. The massive, sprawling, sophisticated civilization that was hidden beneath the jungle for centuries. An empire built on revolutionary ideas, ingenious engineering, and absolute power. An empire that rose from a mountaintop ceremony in the year 802. An empire that created the largest pre-industrial city in the world. An empire that mysteriously declined not because of conquest, but because of climate and water and the very systems that had sustained it for so long. But to understand how one violent king could command 300,000 people to build his tomb for 3 decades, we need to go back to the beginning, to a mountaintop ceremony that would change Southeast Asian history forever. In the year 802, a prince named Jayavarman climbed to the summit of a sacred mountain called Phnom Kulen. What happened on that mountaintop would echo through the next 6 centuries and enable the construction of some of the most ambitious monuments in human history. He declared himself not just a king, but a god, not in some symbolic, metaphorical sense. In the Khmer understanding, Jayavarman II became a literal manifestation of the divine, a living embodiment of the Hindu gods Shiva and Vishnu. His subjects weren't just obeying a ruler. They were serving the universe made flesh. The ceremony had a name that sounds almost impossibly grand: the establishment of the Devaraja, the God King. And Jayavarman took for himself the title Chakravartin Universal Ruler, Lord of the universe itself. Now, here's what makes this remarkable. This wasn't just religious theater. It was a political technology that would power an empire for more than 600 years. Think about what this meant in practice. If the king is literally divine, then building his temple isn't just architecture. It's sacred duty. Paying taxes isn't supporting a government. It's offering tribute to God. Quarrying stones in brutal tropical heat isn't forced labor. It's spiritual service. And the king's physical body, or more precisely, his divine essence, was represented by something called a linga, a phallic idol. This sacred object was housed at the center of Temple Mountains, representing the cosmic axis around which the universe revolves. Each major Khmer king built his own Temple Mountain, his own axis mundi, his own connection point between earth and heaven. This created something fascinating, a kind of competitive monument building that lasted for centuries. Each king needed to build something worthy of a god, something that proved his divine legitimacy, and ideally, something that surpassed what his predecessors built. Imagine the pressure. You claim to be the manifestation of the divine. Your great-grandfather built a massive temple complex. Your grandfather built something even more impressive. Now it's your turn. You can't just match them. You have to exceed them. For 629 years, this system drove the Khmer Empire to create temple after temple, each more ambitious than the last, each consuming more resources, each requiring more labor, each reaching higher toward the heavens. But where did this idea come from? Jayavarman II hadn't always been in Cambodia. According to the inscriptions, he'd spent time in Java, which might mean the Indonesian islands, or might refer to the kingdom of Champa to the east. Wherever he was, he learned something important. He learned about divine kingship in a way that was practiced elsewhere, and he brought it back with him. When he returned to Cambodia, the region was fractured. Multiple kingdoms competed for power in what had once been a unified realm called Chenla. Jayavarman II spent decades conquering and consolidating these territories. The ceremony on Phnom Kulen in 802 wasn't just a religious ritual. It was a declaration of victory and unification. From that point forward, the Khmer Empire would be different from its neighbors. Its kings wouldn't just rule by military might or political skill. They would rule by divine right, taken to its absolute extreme. And the architecture they commissioned reflected this cosmic ambition. At its height, the Khmer Empire controlled territory stretching across what is now Cambodia, significant portions of Thailand and Laos, and parts of southern Vietnam. Millions of people, vast agricultural lands, trade routes connecting China to India. But the real power of the God-King system was this. It made the impossible possible. 300,000 workers building a temple for 37 years? That's possible when you're serving God himself. Carving 500 meters of continuous bas-reliefs, showing mythological battles? That's appropriate when you're depicting the divine cosmos. Transporting 1,500-pound stones 25 miles from quarries to construction site? That's reasonable when you're building heaven on earth. The Devaraga concept justified extraordinary expenditure of resources and human effort on a scale that few other civilizations could match. And it worked. For a very long time, it worked. But, and this is important, the system eventually evolved in a way that would contribute to the empire's transformation centuries later. When Buddhism began to spread through the Khmer territories in the 13th and 14th centuries, it brought a different understanding of kingship. Buddhist kings weren't gods. They were enlightened humans, spiritual leaders, certainly, worthy of respect and honor, but not divine. That subtle shift had enormous consequences. When the king is a god, his word is absolute. When the king is an enlightened human, his authority can be questioned. When the king is divine, building a massive temple is cosmic necessity. When the king is human, Spending vast resources on monuments becomes harder to justify. The adoption of Theravada Buddhism didn't destroy the Khmer Empire overnight, but it did erode the foundation that had enabled those massive construction projects. It reduced the king's ability to command the kind of total mobilization that built Angkor Wat. Later kings would still build, but never again on the scale of the 12th century. Never again with quite that same conviction that they were literally constructing the cosmos in stone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That decline was centuries away. For now, in the centuries after Jayavarman II's mountaintop ceremony, the God-King system drove the Khmer Empire to heights of architectural achievement that wouldn't be matched until the Industrial Revolution. Temple after temple rose from the plains and jungles of Cambodia, each one a cosmic diagram carved in sandstone, each one a mountain connecting earth to heaven, each one housing the divine essence of the God-King who commissioned it. And the people who built them, those hundreds of thousands of workers, weren't just laborers. In the Khmer understanding, they were participants in a sacred act, building the universe itself. This is what made Angkor possible. Not just the engineering knowledge or the organizational skill, though both were impressive, but the absolute certainty shared by king and commoner alike that this work was divinely ordained. That certainty would sustain the empire for 6 centuries. It would produce Angkor Wat and dozens of other temples. It would create the largest pre-industrial city in human history. But to understand how that city actually functioned, how it supported nearly 1 million people in the tropical heat without modern technology, we need to look at what those laser scans revealed. Not just temples and monuments, but an engineering marvel that would make modern hydraulic engineers take notice. For 6 centuries, this God-King system drove the Khmer Empire to build temple after temple, each trying to surpass the last. But in 2012, something extraordinary happened. Technology revealed that what we'd been looking at, the temples we could see, was only a tiny fraction of what the Khmer actually built. For more than 150 years, archaeologists studied Angkor. They measured stones. They documented inscriptions. They carefully mapped every visible temple. They published papers and books. They built entire academic careers on understanding this place, and they missed almost everything. It's not that they were incompetent. It's that the jungle is an extraordinarily effective hiding place. When you're standing on the forest floor, surrounded by massive trees and dense undergrowth, you can't see patterns. You can't see the grid of ancient streets beneath your feet. You can't see that the small hill to your left is actually a temple platform. You can't see that the slight depression running through the landscape is actually a canal that once carried thousands of gallons of water. You see trees, vines, mud, the chaos of tropical vegetation, reclaiming what humans once built. But in 2012, everything changed. A team led by Damien Evans from the French School of the Far East flew helicopters over the jungles of Cambodia. Mounted beneath those helicopters was a sophisticated piece of equipment that would revolutionize our understanding of the Khmer Empire. LiDAR, light detection and ranging. Here's how it works. The system fires millions of laser pulses downward every few seconds. Millions. Each pulse travels at the speed of light, bouncing off whatever it hits. Most of them, maybe 95%, hit leaves, branches, tree trunks. They bounce back immediately, creating a detailed map of the jungle canopy. But about 5% of those pulses slip through. They find gaps in the foliage. They travel all the way to the ground. And when they bounce back, they reveal something that's been invisible for centuries. The actual shape of the earth. Strip away the trees, strip away the vegetation. What's left is topography. And in topography, you can see what human hands created. The subtle ridges that mark ancient walls, the geometric depressions that show where roads once ran, the elevated platforms where buildings stood. It's like having X-ray vision for forests. When Damien Evans first looked at the LiDAR data coming through, he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Near a temple called Preah Khan, about 60 miles northeast of Angkor Wat, archaeologists had been searching for evidence of urban settlement for 10 years. 10 years of walking transects through the jungle, cutting through undergrowth, mapping every stone they found, trying to piece together where people had lived. Then the LiDAR data processed. All of a sudden, Evans said, the city has more or less instantly appeared on the screen in front of us. 10 years of searching. And then, in an instant, there it was. City blocks laid out in precise grids, roads connecting neighborhoods, the geometric precision of planned urban development. All of it hidden beneath the jungle canopy. All of it invisible to anyone standing on the ground. Roland Fletcher, an archaeologist from the University of Sydney who worked on the LiDAR surveys, called it embarrassingly exciting. Because here's what they realized. They'd been walking over these cities for decades, literally walking directly over organized urban infrastructure without knowing it was there. The data revealed something stunning. Greater Angkor, the urban complex, surrounding the famous temples, covered over 1,000 square kilometers. That's 390 square miles, larger than modern Los Angeles, about 4 times the size of Manhattan, and almost all of it was invisible from the ground. The LiDAR scans showed thousands of individual features: roads connecting distant temples, elaborate canal networks, neighborhoods organized around smaller temples and shrines, embankments and reservoirs, agricultural features, everything you'd need to support a massive urban population. At its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries, Greater Angkor supported somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million people. That made it the largest pre-industrial city in the entire world. Not just in Southeast Asia, not just in the tropics, in the world. There was nothing comparable in medieval Europe, nothing comparable in China, nothing comparable anywhere until you get to the industrial cities of the 19th century. Roland Fletcher put it bluntly. There was nothing like Greater Angkor until the advent of 19th century industrial cities. Think about what that means. For thousands of years of human civilization, cities were limited by fundamental constraints. How far could you walk to get to work? How far could you carry water? How could you move food from farms to urban centers without spoilage? These constraints kept cities relatively compact. Even the great imperial capitals of China and Rome were dense, concentrated places. Urban sprawl was supposed to be impossible without trains and trucks and modern infrastructure. But the Khmer solved this problem in the 12th century. They built a sprawling metropolitan region that functioned for centuries. And they did it with ox carts and canals and human labor. The LiDAR revealed how. The entire urban area was organized around water, massive reservoirs, intricate canal networks, embankments and channels that directed flow for monsoon rains, roads that followed the high ground between water features, neighborhoods clustered around access to the hydraulic system. Water was the key. Water was everything. But the LiDAR discoveries didn't stop with just revealing the city's extent. They found specific features that completely surprised archaeologists. Strange geometric patterns, anomalies in the landscape, things that didn't fit any known category of Khmer architecture. South of Angkor Wat's main moat, they found massive spiral earthwork structures, coiled patterns stretching for over a kilometer, made of raised sandbanks separated by channels. Nothing else like them exists in Khmer architecture. Their function is completely unknown. They found evidence of temporary wooden towers that once surrounded the main temple complex. Gone now, of course, wood doesn't survive in tropical conditions, but the post holes remained, revealed by those laser pulses finding tiny depressions in the earth. They found hundreds of small ponds within temple enclosures. When archaeologists excavated a few, they discovered modest dwellings and pottery suggesting temple workers lived there. Not elites, not priests, but the everyday staff who maintained the temples. Dancers, perhaps. Officials. Craftspeople. Every new scan revealed more complexity, more layers, more evidence that the Khmer civilization was far more sophisticated, far more organized, and far larger than anyone had imagined. But here's what struck me as most remarkable about this story. The technology that revealed all this LiDAR has only existed for a couple of decades. It took us until the 21st century to develop tools that could see through the jungle. For over 150 years, archaeologists studied Angkor using the best methods available to them. They worked carefully, systematically, thoroughly, and they still missed the vast majority of what was there. It makes you wonder what else is hidden, what other civilizations are waiting beneath jungles or deserts or oceans, invisible to our current technology. What will we discover in another 50 years with tools we haven't invented yet? But for now, we have this revelation, this understanding that Angkor Wat, magnificent as it is, was just one building in a city that stretched to the horizon, a city that rivaled anything humans would build for another 700 years. And to understand how that city functioned, how it sustained nearly 1 million people in the tropical heat, we need to look more closely at what the LiDAR revealed about water. Because the Khmer didn't just manage water, they mastered it. Imagine trying to build a city in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, tropical Cambodia, where the monsoon season dumps torrential rain for months, turning everything into muddy chaos. And then the dry season arrives, and water becomes scarce. Most civilizations would pick a different location, somewhere with more consistent rainfall, somewhere with natural water sources year-round, somewhere easier. The Khmer didn't just accept the challenge. They turned it into their civilization's defining achievement. What the LiDAR revealed wasn't just the extent of Greater Angkor. It was the sophistication of the hydraulic engineering that made it all possible. The entire city, that 1,000-square-kilometer urban sprawl, was organized around controlling, storing, and distributing water. And the scale of what they built is genuinely hard to comprehend. Let's start with the berets. These were massive artificial reservoirs built to capture and store water from the monsoon rains. The Khmer built 4 of them around Angkor, but to call them reservoirs almost feels inadequate. These weren't ponds. They were lakes, enormous engineered lakes carved into the landscape. The largest won the West. Beret measures 8 kilometers long and a little over 2 kilometers wide. That's about 5 miles long and just over a mile wide. Try to visualize that for a moment. A human-made lake stretching for 5 miles, built in the 12th century, without bulldozers, without explosives, without any of the heavy machinery we take for granted. The West Beret could hold somewhere between 48 and 50 million cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, you could fill the Great Pyramid of Giza with water over 20 times using just this one reservoir. And remember, this was just one of 4. These berets weren't just impressive feats of construction. They were ingenious pieces of engineering that worked automatically with the environment. During the dry season, water from Mount Kulin a sacred mountain about 25 miles northeast of Angkor, flowed naturally toward the Siem Reap River. But during the monsoon season, when water volumes increased dramatically, the system automatically diverted excess flow into multiple channels. Water would split between the Pork River and the Siem Reap River, distributing the load and preventing any single channel from being overwhelmed. The Khmer engineers designed spillways and embankments that reduced turbulence and prevented erosion. They understood hydraulic principles that wouldn't be formally described in European engineering texts for centuries. They created a system that largely managed itself, responding automatically to seasonal changes without requiring constant intervention. And it wasn't just about storing water. It was about moving it where it needed to go. The LiDAR scans revealed an extensive network of canals connecting the berets to each other, to the temples, and to agricultural areas. These canals weren't simple ditches. They were carefully graded, maintaining precise slopes to ensure water flowed at the right speed. Too fast, and you get erosion. Too slow, and you get stagnation and sediment buildup. The Khmer got it right. For centuries, their canals moved water efficiently across that vast urban landscape. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came in 2012, when researchers Etsuo Uchida and Ichita Shimoda were studying how the Khmer transported the massive sandstone blocks used to build Angkor Wat. The prevailing theory had been that stones were quarried at Mount Kulin, then transported about 54 miles around Tonle Sap Lake via rivers and canals before reaching the construction site. Using satellite imagery and field investigations, Uchida and Shimoda discovered something different. They found over 50 quarries at Mount Kulin, and they found a canal network that connected those quarries directly to Angkor Wat. Not 54 miles, 22 miles. The Khmer had built a massive transportation infrastructure just to enable temple construction. They dug a 22-mile canal specifically to move stone from quarry to building site. This wasn't part of the main hydraulic system. This was infrastructure built to support infrastructure. Think about the organizational capability that represents. You're planning to build the largest temple in your civilization's history. So first, you build a canal network spanning 22 miles to make the stone transport feasible. That's the preliminary project. The infrastructure necessary before you can even start the main work. And it worked. Those millions of sandstone blocks, each weighing up to 1,500 pounds, could be loaded onto rafts at the quarries and floated downstream directly to the construction site. The canal made the impossible merely extremely difficult. This is what archaeologists mean when they call Greater Angkor a hydraulic city. It wasn't just that the city had water management systems. It was that water management was the fundamental organizing principle of the entire civilization. The placement of temples, the layout of neighborhoods, the location of roads, the agricultural zones, everything was determined by access to the hydraulic network. The water system wasn't built to serve the city. The city was built around the water system. At its peak, this sophisticated network supported between 750,000 and 1 million people. Nearly 1 million people living in a tropical climate where water is either too abundant or too scarce, depending on the season. The Khmer solved that problem through engineering brilliance and enormous labor investment. They captured the monsoon rains. They stored water for the dry season. They distributed it across a vast urban area. They transported building materials on canals. They supported agriculture and drinking water and temple construction and everything else a major civilization requires. For centuries, it worked beautifully. But, and here's something important to keep in mind, the very sophistication of the system created a kind of vulnerability. When you build a city designed around hydraulic engineering, you become dependent on that engineering. If something disrupts the water system, the entire civilization is at risk. The Khmer built an engineering marvel, but they also built something fragile in ways they might not have fully understood. That fragility would matter later. It would matter a great deal, but we're not there yet. For now, in the 12th and 13th centuries, Greater Angkor stood as a triumph of human ingenuity, the largest pre-industrial city in the world, sustained by the most sophisticated water management system of its time. And within that vast urban landscape, there were details, mysteries, features that archaeologists are still trying to understand. Things revealed by the LiDAR that don't fit into any neat category. The hydraulic system was only part of what made Angkor extraordinary. The architecture itself contains mysteries we're still trying to solve. Even with LiDAR revealing the hidden city, even with decades of careful archaeological study, Angkor still holds its secrets. Some of the most intriguing discoveries are things archaeologists can see perfectly clearly, measure precisely, and map in detail, but they still can't explain them. South of Angkor Wat's main moat, the LiDAR scans revealed something that stopped researchers in their tracks. 8 massive spiral structures, coiled earthwork patterns, each one stretching over 1 kilometer long and half a kilometer wide. They're made of raised sandbanks, separated by channels, arranged in deliberate geometric spirals. Roland Fletcher, that archaeologist from the University of Sydney, called these spirals the most striking discovery associated with Angkor Wat to date, and their function, completely unknown. These structures have no equivalent anywhere else in Khmer architecture. Nothing even close. Archaeologists have excavated portions of them and found the sandbanks to be archaeologically sterile, meaning no artifacts, no pottery shards, no tool marks, nothing that would tell us what they were used for. Some researchers have suggested they might have been ritual gardens, perhaps spaces for growing aromatic plants used in temple ceremonies. Sandalwood, maybe, lotus, sacred flowers, and incense materials. The spiral channels could have provided irrigation for these plantings. Others think they might have been ornamental gardens on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the great European palace gardens of the 18th century. Imagine elaborate landscaping designs sprawling across kilometers, meant to be viewed from the temple towers above. But here's the fascinating part. There's evidence these spirals might never have been completed. They seem to date to the mid to late 12th century, right around the time Angkor Wat was being built. It's possible they were part of an ambitious expansion plan that was abandoned partway through. Perhaps when Jayavarman II died. Perhaps when resources were needed elsewhere. We may never know for certain. And there's something beautiful about that. Despite all our modern technology, despite laser scans that can see through jungle canopy, some mysteries remain. But the spirals aren't the only puzzle at Angkor. Let me tell you about the apsaras and devatas. These are carved figures of women adorning the walls and galleries of Angkor Wat, celestial dancers and standing goddesses, their bodies in graceful poses, their hands forming delicate gestures. For 150 years, scholars who studied Angkor described these carvings as decorative, just ornamental elements to beautify the temple. When visitors asked about them, they were told these were imaginary women, celestial beings, generic artistic representations. But in 1927, a researcher named Sappho Marchal did something simple but revolutionary. She actually counted them. More than that, she looked at them closely, individually, and she discovered something extraordinary. There are over 1,800 apsarasas and devatas carved on Angkor Wat, and every single one is unique. every single one. No two have the same facial features. No two have identical hairstyles. No two wear the same jewelry or costumes. No two hold their hands in exactly the same gesture. Their poses vary. The details of their clothing vary. The flowers they hold, the tiaras they wear, the way their hair is arranged. All different. Think about what that means. 1,800 individual portraits carved in stone, each one showing a distinct person with unique characteristics. A researcher named Kent Davis, who has studied these carvings extensively, puts it bluntly. These can't be decorative. They can't be generic imaginary women, in his words. They represent the most complex collection of full-body portrait carvings ever created in a single ancient human generation. So who were they? The traditional explanation, that they're imaginary wives to serve the king in heaven, doesn't hold up when you look at the level of individual detail. You don't create 1,800 unique portraits of imaginary people. Were they real women? Court dancers whose images were immortalized in stone? Members of the royal family? Political figures? Wives of nobles? Perhaps a combination? We don't know. The inscriptions don't tell us. The historical records that might have explained it rotted away centuries ago on palm leaves in the tropical humidity. But the carvings remain. 1,800 women frozen in stone, each one distinct, each one representing someone who lived and breathed in the 12th century, someone whose image was considered important enough to carve with exquisite care into the walls of the largest temple ever built. Modern Cambodian classical dance draws directly from these carvings. Young dancers trained for years to master the precise hand positions, the graceful poses, the finger flexibility that allows them to bend their hands back in steep curves, just like the stone apsaras. So, in a sense, these 1,800 women aren't entirely mysterious. They live on in the movements of dancers today, their gestures passed down through centuries, from stone to human bodies to the next generation. The LiDAR revealed other puzzles too, evidence of temporary wooden towers that once surrounded the main temple complex. These structures are completely gone now. Wood doesn't survive in tropical conditions, but the post holes remain, creating geometric patterns visible only from above. What were these towers for? Ceremonial purposes? Practical construction scaffolding that was left in place? Viewing platforms? We're not entirely sure. Hundreds of small ponds within the temple enclosures. When archaeologists excavated near some of these ponds, they found remains of modest dwellings and everyday pottery. This suggests temple staff lived there. The people who maintained the complex performed rituals, kept the place functioning. But the density of these ponds raises questions. Why so many? Were they symbolic? Each one representing something in the temple's spiritual geography? Were they practical water sources? Both? The answers keep slipping away, just out of reach. And maybe that's appropriate. Angkor Wat was built as a cosmic diagram, a representation of the Hindu universe carved in stone. Mount Meru, the center of the cosmos, represented by the central towers. The oceans, represented by the moats. The continents, represented by the galleries and courtyards. When you're trying to build the universe, there's going to be symbolism and meaning layered upon meaning. Things that made perfect sense to the people who built it, but that are nearly impossible to fully recover 800 years later. We can measure the spirals, but we can't know exactly what the Khmer felt when they walked through those coiled paths. We can count the apsaras, but we can't know the names of the women they represent, or why each one was important enough to carve. We can map the ponds, but we can't know all the meanings they held. Technology has revealed the hidden city, but it hasn't revealed all the answers. perhaps it never will. And there's something strangely comforting about that. That even with satellites and laser scans and sophisticated archaeological techniques, the past still keeps its secrets, still maintains its sense of mystery. We know so much more than we did, but there's still so much we don't know. While some mysteries remain carved in stone, we do know exactly who was responsible for Angkor Wat's creation. And his story is as complex as the monument itself. Jayavarman II ruled the Khmer Empire for 37 years, from around 1113 to 1150. Nearly 4 decades of absolute power as a divine king. And he spent almost all of it building his tomb. Think about that choice for a moment. You've seized power through violence. You've established yourself as the manifestation of a god. You command millions of subjects across a vast empire. You could build anything, do anything. Your word is literally divine law, and you choose to spend your entire reign constructing the place where your body will rest after death. There's something both magnificent and melancholy about that. A warrior king who killed to claim power, devoting everything to his own monument. Not a palace to live in, not fortifications to defend his realm. A mausoleum, the most elaborate eternal resting place ever conceived. Angkor Wat wasn't just large, it was precise. The stone blocks fit together so tightly that in many places you can barely see the joints. No mortar holds them together. Just the sheer accuracy of the cutting and placement. Each block had to be transported those 22 miles from the quarries, loaded onto rafts, floated down the canal, unloaded at the construction site, then positioned exactly, perfectly, so that it would lock into place with the blocks around it. 300,000 workers, 6,000 elephants, 37 years of continuous effort. And Jayavarman made one more unusual choice. He dedicated his temple to Vishnu rather than Shiva. In Khmer tradition, most temples honored Shiva, the destroyer and transformer. Shiva was the god most associated with kingship, with sacred power, with the cosmic dance of creation and destruction. But Jayavarman chose Vishnu, the preserver, the protector, the god who maintains cosmic order and descends to earth as an avatar when the world needs saving. Why? We're not entirely certain. Some scholars think it reflected Jayavarman's personal devotion. Others suggest it was a political statement aligning himself with preservation and order after the violence of his rise to power. Perhaps it was both. What we do know is that the choice shaped every detail of the temple. The bas-reliefs, those continuous stone carvings running for over 500 meters along the gallery walls, depict scenes from Hindu epics closely associated with Vishnu. The churning of the ocean of milk, the battle of Kurukshetra, Vishnu's avatar Krishna defeating demons, and those reliefs proceed counterclockwise. In Hindu funeral rites, mourners circle the deceased counterclockwise. It's the direction of ending, of completion, of death. Every visitor to Angkor Wat, whether they realized it or not, was performing a funeral circumambulation. The temple faces west, toward the setting sun, toward the direction of death. Everything about Angkor Wat speaks to its purpose as a mausoleum, a sacred mountain where a god-king would transition from earthly life to cosmic immortality. But Jayavarman didn't spend all 37 years peacefully overseeing construction. He was still a warrior. The inscriptions record military campaigns against neighboring kingdoms, particularly Champa to the east. He expanded Khmer territory. He maintained the empire through force when necessary. Around 1150, Jayavarman II died. The exact circumstances aren't clear, but he may have died during or after a military campaign. What we know for certain is this: he never saw his temple completed. 37 years of construction, millions of stone blocks, hundreds of thousands of workers, the largest religious monument in the world. And he died before it was finished. The work continued after his death, of course. The decorative elements, some of the finer carvings, the completion of outer galleries, these were finished in the years that followed. But Sir Jayavarman himself never walked through the completed temple, never saw his life's work whole and finished. There's a profound irony in that. This monument to permanence, this attempt to carve immortality in stone, outlasted its creator before it was even done. Modern engineers who study Angkor Wat are consistently amazed by its construction. The precise alignment to astronomical features, the mathematical sophistication of its proportions, the engineering knowledge required to build such massive stone structures in a tropical environment where ground stability is always a challenge. One estimate suggested that building Angkor Wat with current technology would take 300 years, 3 centuries. Sir Jayavarman's workers did it in about 1/10 that time, and they did it without cranes, without concrete, without steel reinforcement, without computer modeling, without any of the tools that make modern large-scale construction possible. They had knowledge, skill, organization, and the absolute authority of a god king to mobilize whatever resources were necessary. When you stand before Angkor Wat today, and millions of people do every year, you're looking at the vision of one man made real by the labor of hundreds of thousands. You're looking at ambition on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. You're looking at what became possible when religious authority, political power, and architectural genius aligned. But you're also looking at something else, a monument built by violence. That Elephant Coup, the assassination of a king so that his nephew could seize power and build his eternal resting place. Beauty and brutality all mixed together in stone. Sir Jayavarman II created something that has lasted nearly 900 years and will likely last hundreds more. His temple survived wars, climate disasters, regime changes, the collapse of his civilization, the growth of jungle over everything he built. He achieved a kind of immortality. People who know nothing else about the Khmer Empire recognize Angkor Wat. His monument appears on Cambodia's flag. Millions of visitors from around the world come to see what he built. But we don't really know him, not as a person. The inscriptions tell us about his victories, his construction projects, his divine status. They don't tell us what he thought about, whether he was satisfied with his reign, whether he feared death, whether he ever doubted the massive expenditure of resources on his tomb, while people in his empire struggled. We have his monument, but the man himself remains distant, remote, a figure carved in stone just like those mysterious apsaras, visible but ultimately unknowable. Sir Jayavarman II built the world's largest Hindu temple, but decades after his death, another king would transform the entire empire from Hindu to Buddhist, and he would build something even stranger. After Sir Jayavarman II died, the Khmer Empire went through decades of turmoil, succession disputes, wars with neighboring kingdoms, the kind of instability that can tear a civilization apart. Then, around 1181, a new king rose to power. His name was Jayavarman VII, and he would transform everything. Jayavarman VII was already in his 50s or 60s when he took the throne, not a young warrior seizing power like Sir Jayavarman. He was older, perhaps wiser, certainly different. He'd lived through the chaos, watched the empire struggle, seen the devastation wrought by wars with Champa, and when he finally claimed power, He didn't just rebuild. He reimagined the entire spiritual foundation of the civilization. Jayavarman VII transformed the Khmer Empire from a Hindu kingdom to a Buddhist one. Not the gradual Buddhism. That would come later. But Mahayana Buddhism, the greater vehicle. A form of Buddhism that emphasized compassion, that created bodhisattvas, enlightened beings, who delay their own final enlightenment to help others achieve liberation. The God King concept didn't disappear entirely, but it evolved. Jayavarman wasn't claiming to be Shiva or Vishnu made flesh. He was presenting himself as a manifestation of the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, the embodiment of compassion itself. It's a subtle but profound shift from divine power to divine compassion, from the king as cosmic force to the king as enlightened guide. And then he built the Bayon. If you've seen photographs of the Bayon Temple, you know what makes it so distinctive, so haunting. The faces. 54 towers rise from the temple complex, and on those towers are carved 216 giant stone faces, each face approximately four-sided, looking out toward the cardinal directions. The faces are serene, peaceful, with that slight, enigmatic smile that's been compared to the Mona Lisa, eyes half closed in meditation or contemplation. Expressions of complete calm, and they're everywhere. No matter where you stand in the temple complex, faces are watching, looking down from above, looking across at each other, looking out toward the horizon. Hundreds of enormous stone eyes maintaining their gentle gaze. Some scholars believe these faces represent Avalokitesvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. Others think they're portraits of Jayavarman VII himself, merged with the bodhisattva, the king as compassion, compassion as the king. The features certainly seem individualized, not generic or abstract, specific, as if representing a real person. Imagine walking through the Bayon when it was new, when the stone was fresh and the carvings sharp. 216 faces, each several feet tall, all bearing that same serene smile, all watching with that same compassionate gaze. It must have been overwhelming, this architecture of presence, of being constantly observed by divine compassion. Jayavarman VII built more than just the Bayon. He constructed temples throughout the empire. He built hospitals, roads, rest houses for travelers. His inscriptions talk about relieving the suffering of his subjects, about the king's pain being the pain of his people. This was a different kind of kingship, less about cosmic dominance, more about service and compassion, at least in the official rhetoric. Under Jayavarman VII, the empire reached its absolute peak. The population of Greater Angkor approached 1 million. The hydraulic system functioned at maximum capacity. The city sprawled across those 1,000 square kilometers in organized complexity. But the transformation to Buddhism had consequences that wouldn't be fully apparent for decades. The divine authority of earlier god kings, that absolute claim to be the universe incarnate, gave them the power to command anything, to mobilize entire populations for massive projects, to justify extraordinary expenditures. When you're building a mountain for God himself, no effort is too great, no cost too high. But a Buddhist king, even a bodhisattva king, has different authority, more limited in some ways. His power comes from wisdom and compassion, not from being the literal manifestation of cosmic force. It's harder to justify forcing 300,000 people to build your monument when you're supposed to be all about relieving suffering. Jayavarman VII managed it. He built extensively, perhaps more than any king before him, but he would be the last to do so on that scale. After him, Khmer temple construction would never again reach such heights. the Buddhist transformation also made the empire vulnerable in other ways. Later kings who converted to Theravada Buddhism, the way of the elders, more austere, more focused on individual enlightenment, found the god-king concept even harder to maintain. Royal authority eroded. The ability to command massive projects diminished. The spiritual foundation that had enabled 6 centuries of monument building gradually weakened. But none of that was apparent in Jayavarman VII's reign. During his lifetime, which lasted until around 1220, the empire seemed eternal, powerful, unshakable. Those serene faces gazing from the Bayon towers suggested a civilization at peace with itself, enlightened, compassionate, secure. There's a strange epilogue to the story of the Bayon. Decades after Jayavarman VII's death, a later king, Jayavarman VIII, led a Hindu restorationist movement. He systematically defaced Buddhist imagery throughout Angkor. At the Bayon, workers chiseled away Buddha figures. They destroyed carvings. They even threw a 12-foot Buddha statue down a well, where it remained until archaeologists recovered it in 1933. But they left the faces largely intact. Those 216 serene faces continued their eternal gaze, undisturbed by the religious upheaval happening around them. Perhaps because the faces were too ambiguous, too potentially Hindu as well as Buddhist. Or perhaps because they'd become too iconic, too much a part of Angkor's identity to destroy. Whatever the reason, the faces endured. They still endure today, wearing that slight smile, watching with half-closed eyes as the centuries pass. Jayavarman VII died around 1220. His Buddhist empire continued, evolved, transformed. The faces he commissioned continued their watch, and at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, Greater Angkor supported nearly 1 million people, the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. But to appreciate just how remarkable that was, we need to understand the daily life hidden in those vanished streets. Fortunately, we have a witness, one person who visited Angkor at its peak and wrote down what he saw, a Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan. And his account is precious beyond measure because of what happened to every other written record from the Khmer Empire. In the year 1296, a Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan arrived in Cambodia as part of a diplomatic mission from the Yuan dynasty court. He stayed for 11 months, living just outside Angkor Thom's North Gate. "Ben," he says, "I scratch. Building this press and putting days into business. Get it? By days later, I've been devoted to scales to invent. That ass with growth comes complexity." And then he went home and wrote a book. The Customs of Cambodia is the only surviving first-person written account of daily life in the Khmer Empire. The only. Everything else that was written about, everyday Angkor, all the mundane details, all the observations about how people actually lived rotted away centuries ago. You see, the Khmer wrote on palm leaves, occasionally on animal skins. These materials don't survive in tropical humidity. Within decades, maybe a century at most, they decay into nothing. The monumental stone inscriptions endured. The temples themselves endured. But the everyday written records simply vanished. Zhou Daguan wrote on paper, Chinese paper. And when he returned to China, his manuscript was copied, preserved, passed down. Only about a third of his original text survives today, but that third is precious beyond measure. It's the only window we have into the daily life of Angkor at its peak. Let me share some of what he saw. Zhou noted that women dominated commerce in Angkor. They ran the markets. They handled money. They managed trade. When Chinese traders arrived with goods, They negotiated with women. This wasn't unusual or remarked upon as strange. It was simply how things worked. He described the markets themselves. They had no permanent buildings, no shops in the way he was familiar with from Chinese cities. Instead, each merchant spread a mat on the ground and displayed their goods. But interestingly, they still had to pay rent for their space, even though there was no physical structure provided. The king, Zhou wrote, was served by beautiful ladies who attended him constantly. The exact nature of their service was left somewhat ambiguous in his account, though he noted there were many of them, and they seemed to have significant presence in court life. Zhou described something that particularly fascinated him: the bowls people used. He wrote that people had no recognizable bowls or buckets in the Chinese style. Instead, they served soup and liquids in tiny vessels made from woven leaves, made waterproof somehow. Imagine disposable leaf bowls at every meal, woven fresh, used once, discarded. It's such a small detail, so mundane, but it brings ancient Angkor to life in a way that temple measurements never could. You can almost see it. A market stall, someone ladling soup into a carefully woven leaf bowl, the slight green smell of fresh vegetation, the practical ingenuity of making serving vessels from what's growing all around you. Zhou observed the architecture and confirmed what the ruins show us. Buildings were substantial, well constructed. The temples were magnificent beyond description. But he also noted something that might have seemed obvious, but is actually important. Most buildings were made of wood and thatch, not stone. Only temples and the most important structures used stone construction. That's why so much of ancient Angkor disappeared. The temples survived because they were stone, but the houses, the workshops, the granaries, the everyday buildings that made up most of the city, those were wood and thatch. They rotted away, leaving almost nothing behind except the faint traces that LiDAR eventually revealed. Zhou described royal processions with golden parasols and elaborate ceremonies. He wrote about religious practices, about the Hindu and Buddhist temples coexisting, about rituals he witnessed but didn't fully understand. And then he mentioned something darker. He noted that the empire had been utterly devastated by a recent war with Siam the Thai kingdoms to the west. This was around 1296, more than a century before the traditional date of Angkor's fall in 1431. Already the cracks were showing. Already the empire was under pressure. Wars were taking their toll. Resources were being strained. The eternal city wasn't quite as eternal as it might have seemed from inside. But Zhou was an outsider, a visitor. He saw what was visible on the surface, but couldn't know what was happening in the deeper structure of Khmer society. He couldn't know that climate patterns were shifting, that the hydraulic system was beginning to face unprecedented challenges, that the empire was heading toward a transformation that would reshape everything. He just recorded what he saw: markets and leaf bowls and beautiful ladies in magnificent temples, and the scars of recent war. When Zhou Daguan left Cambodia and returned to China, he probably didn't realize how important his observations would become. He was just writing a travel account, the kind of thing diplomats and traders often did, describing a foreign place for people back home who would never see it themselves. But because every Khmer record rotted away, Zhou's account became irreplaceable. It's the voice of Angkor, the only detailed first-person description of what life was actually like in that vast city, revealed by LiDAR. Without Zhou Daguan, we'd have stones and ruins and artifacts. We'd have impressive archaeology, but we wouldn't know about the leaf bowls. We wouldn't know that women ran the markets. We wouldn't have that sense of everyday human life happening in the shadow of those enormous temples. His account reminds us that Angkor wasn't just monuments. It was 1 million people living their lives, trading in markets, serving soup in woven leaf bowls, attending court ceremonies, surviving wars, getting up each morning in a tropical city organized around water and stone and divine kingship. Real people. Not so different from us, despite the centuries and the cultural distance. Solving practical problems, creating beauty, building a civilization that would eventually transform into something else. Zhou Daguan witnessed an empire that seemed eternal, even while showing cracks. But within 150 years of his visit, the jungle would begin reclaiming those streets. The great city would transform into scattered communities and hidden temples. The question is, why? What happened to bring down the largest pre-industrial city in the world? For a long time, the story of Angkor's end was simple. In 1431, armies from Ayutthaya, the Siamese kingdom to the west, sacked the city. The Khmer abandoned their capital and moved to Phnom Penh on the Mekong. The jungle reclaimed what was left. Conquest, abandonment, the end. But like many simple stories, this one turns out to be incomplete. The truth is more complex, and in some ways more troubling. In 2010, a team of scientists published research based on tree ring analysis from Vietnam, about 700 kilometers from Angkor. These tree rings contain a record of rainfall going back centuries. They show something startling. Beginning in the 1330s and continuing through the 1360s, mainland Southeast Asia experienced decades of severe drought. Then, in the early 1400s through the 1420s, another multi-decade drought struck. Between these droughts, the region was hit by unusually intense monsoon flooding. The pattern was devastating. Extended periods of too little water, punctuated by overwhelming surges of too much water. The kind of climate variability that can bring down even sophisticated civilizations. And remember what we learned about Greater Angkor. The entire city, that 1,000 square kilometer urban sprawl supporting nearly 1 million people, was organized around water management. The berets captured monsoon rains. The canals distributed water during dry seasons. The whole system depended on relatively predictable seasonal patterns. Drought and flood in alternating cycles destroyed that predictability. During the droughts, the reservoirs couldn't refill properly. Water levels dropped. Agricultural production suffered. The canals that distributed water across the city began to fail. You can't distribute what you don't have. And then the floods came. After years of drought, the infrastructure was weakened. Maintenance had likely been neglected. When water is scarce, you're focused on finding it, not maintaining empty canals. Embankments dried out and cracked. Spillways clogged with debris. When the intense monsoons hit, they hit a damaged system. Water overwhelmed the weakened infrastructure. Embankments broke. Canals eroded. The careful hydraulic engineering that had sustained the city for centuries began to cascade into failure. Researchers from the University of Sydney used computer modeling to simulate what happened. They found that the water distribution network was vulnerable to cascading failures. One canal break led to increased pressure on neighboring canals. Those broke in turn, like dominoes falling, one after another. The very sophistication of the system made it fragile. Everything was connected. Everything depended on everything else. When one piece failed, the whole network began to unravel. There's physical evidence of this crisis scattered around Angkor. Near Angkor Thom, archaeologists found a bridge built from recycled temple stones, intricately carved blocks, pulled from sacred structures, and repurposed for mundane infrastructure. And the bridge crosses a waterway that no longer exists. There's no water beneath it. This tells a story. When a civilization starts cannibalizing its sacred monuments for emergency infrastructure repairs, something has gone seriously wrong. When you build a bridge over a waterway that's already dried up, you're responding to crisis, not planning for the future. The hydraulic system that sustained 1 million people for centuries couldn't adapt to the climate variability. The problem wasn't just drought. It wasn't just flooding. It was, as researcher Dan Penny explained, the variability between both. The system was designed for a predictable pattern, and that pattern broke down. Sophisticated engineering alone couldn't save them. Technology alone couldn't overcome environmental limits. This doesn't mean the 1431 Siamese invasion was irrelevant. It happened. The city was attacked. But by that point, Angkor was already in crisis, already struggling with decades of infrastructure failure, already transforming. The invasion was a symptom of weakness, not the cause of collapse. A vulnerable civilization under environmental stress is vulnerable to military conquest, too. What's striking about this story is how modern it feels. A civilization built around managing water. Sophisticated technology that works beautifully under normal conditions. Then climate patterns shift beyond what the system was designed to handle. Cascading failures. Crisis responses that don't address the underlying problem. The parallels to our own time are hard to miss. Modern cities with elaborate water infrastructure, climate patterns becoming less predictable, systems optimized for historical conditions that may no longer hold. The Khmer weren't stupid. They weren't incompetent. They built the most sophisticated hydraulic system in the pre-industrial world. They sustained the largest city on Earth for centuries. They understood water management in ways that still impress modern engineers. But they couldn't control the monsoons. They couldn't stop multi-decade droughts or intense flooding cycles. They couldn't predict or prevent climate variability on that scale. And here's what makes this particularly poignant. The water system was Angkor's greatest achievement. The thing that made the impossible city possible. The infrastructure that separated Greater Angkor from every other pre-industrial urban center. That same system became the city's greatest vulnerability. When the climate patterns the engineers had designed for no longer held true, the entire civilization was at risk. All those interconnected canals and reservoirs and embankments, they worked beautifully as long as the monsoons followed historical patterns. When those patterns changed, the sophistication of the system meant that failures cascaded faster and more completely. A simpler water system might have been more resilient, less efficient perhaps, but less vulnerable to total collapse when conditions shifted. There are limits to what even brilliant engineering can accomplish. There are forces larger than human ingenuity. Natural systems operate on scales and timelines that don't bend to human planning, no matter how sophisticated that planning might be. That's a humbling lesson, and maybe an important one to remember. As the hydraulic system failed and the monsoons became unpredictable, the empire didn't collapse overnight. Instead, something more complex happened. A gradual transformation that archaeologists are only now beginning to understand. When we talk about civilizations collapsing, we tend to imagine dramatic endings, cities abandoned overnight, people fleeing, everything falling apart at once, but that's rarely how it actually happens. In 2016, researcher Dan Penny and his team published findings from a rather unglamorous source, drill cores taken from the moats surrounding Angkor's temples. They analyzed the pollen trapped in layers of sediment going back centuries. Pollen tells a story. Different plants produce different pollen. Forest plants versus agricultural plants versus aquatic plants. By looking at which pollen appears in which layers, you can reconstruct what the landscape looked like at different times. What the pollen showed was striking. There was no sudden shift, no dramatic line where everything changed. Instead, there was a gradual transition. Agricultural pollen slowly decreased. Forest pollen slowly increased. It took decades, maybe a century. Angkor didn't collapse. It transformed. People didn't abandon the city all at once in 1431. They gradually moved away over a long period of time. And they moved for practical reasons. The hydraulic system was failing. Water was becoming unreliable. Maintaining the massive infrastructure required resources and organization that were increasingly strained. Why stay in a city where the fundamental systems no longer worked? Meanwhile, other opportunities were emerging. The Mekong Delta to the south offered access to maritime trade routes. The world was changing. International commerce was growing. Coastal cities were becoming more important than inland agricultural centers. Khmer elites began relocating to places like Phnom Penh and Lübeck, cities positioned on the Mekong River with better access to trade with China and beyond. This wasn't defeat, it was adaptation, moving to where the opportunities were. Rural populations didn't necessarily leave the Angkor region at all. They continued living in the area, just not in the dense urban center. The pollen evidence shows continued agricultural activity for generations after the supposed abandonment. People were still there, still farming, still living their lives, just not concentrating in that vast urban sprawl anymore. And here's something important to understand. Angkor Wat itself was never truly abandoned. Buddhist monks continued maintaining the temple throughout the period we think of as Angkor's fall, from the 15th century through the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries right up to today. Over 600 years of continuous religious presence. The temple was converted from Hindu to Buddhist use, but it remained an active site of worship. Monks lived there. Pilgrims visited. Ceremonies were performed. The connection was never broken. So when we say Angkor was lost, we need to be precise about what that means. It was never lost to Cambodians. It was never lost to the Buddhist community that maintained it. The temples weren't swallowed by jungle and forgotten by everyone. What happened was that the urban center, that 1,000 square kilometer megalopolis, gradually depopulated. The great project of building and maintaining a hydraulic city became unsustainable under changing environmental and political conditions. People adapted by moving elsewhere or dispersing into smaller settlements. The monuments remained. The religious significance remained. The cultural memory remained. There's another factor that contributed to the transformation. The shift to Theravada Buddhism that had begun under Jayavarman VII and continued after him. Remember the Devaraja concept, the God King. That religious political system justified and enabled the massive construction projects. It gave kings the authority to mobilize hundreds of thousands of workers. It made building cosmic diagrams in stone a sacred duty. Theravada Buddhism didn't support that kind of kingship. The king was seen as a righteous ruler, certainly, worthy of respect and obedience, but not divine, not a manifestation of God, not someone whose commands were literally the will of the universe. This theological shift had practical consequences. Kings had less absolute authority, less ability to command massive labor projects, less justification for the enormous expenditure of resources on monument construction. So, the great age of Khmer temple building ended, not because of conquest, not because people forgot how to build, but because the ideological foundation that had enabled it for 6 centuries eroded away. The temples already built remained, of course. Magnificent, enormous, but no one was building new ones on that scale anymore. In some ways, this transformation was a return to a more sustainable pattern. The hydraulic city had been extraordinary, but it had also been fragile, dependent on environmental conditions staying within certain parameters. When those parameters changed, the system couldn't adapt. Smaller settlements, more distributed populations, less dependence on massive centralized infrastructure. These patterns are more resilient, even if they're less spectacular. It's not a story of failure. It's a story of people responding to changing conditions the best way they could, moving where opportunities existed, maintaining what was important, adapting to new realities. The empire as a political entity continued for decades after 1431, just with a different center. The Khmer people didn't disappear. They're still there today. The culture evolved, transformed, but didn't vanish. And throughout all of this, the monks at Angkor Wat kept their vigil, maintaining the temple, preserving the sacred space, keeping the connection alive between past and present. When Portuguese explorer Antonio da Madalena visited in 1586, nearly 150 years after the supposed abandonment, he found an active temple complex with monks in residence. When Henri Mouhot arrived in 1860, the monks were still there. They're still there today. The story of Angkor isn't a story of a civilization that collapsed and disappeared. It's a story of a civilization that transformed and continued, that adapted to environmental pressures and political changes, that preserved what mattered most, the sacred spaces, the cultural memory, the connection to the past. While the empire transformed and people adapted, the jungle slowly reclaimed the great city. But even as vines covered the temples, the story of Angkor never truly disappeared. In January of 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot arrived at Angkor. He spent several days exploring the temples, making drawings, writing detailed descriptions in his journal. He compared Angkor Wat to Solomon's temple. He marveled at its grandeur and precision. Then he continued his travels through Southeast Asia. About a year later, he died of malaria in Laos. He was 35 years old. Mouhot never knew that his posthumously published journals would make him famous across Europe as the man who discovered Angkor. There's just one problem with that story. He didn't discover anything. In his own journals, Mouhot acknowledged that others had visited Angkor before him. He knew he wasn't the first European to see the temples, and he certainly knew that the Buddhist monks living there when he arrived had been aware of Angkor's existence all along. But the myth was too appealing to let facts get in the way. A French explorer discovering a lost civilization in the jungle, it fit perfectly with European colonial narratives about bringing civilization and knowledge to the world, about rescuing forgotten wonders from obscurity. The reality was quite different. A Portuguese friar named Antonio da Madalena visited Angkor in 1586. That's 274 years before Mouhot. Nearly 3 centuries earlier, da Madalena wrote about it. His account exists. We have it. But somehow, European scholarship managed to overlook that detail for a very long time. And before da Madalena, Zhou Daguan visited and documented Angkor in 1296, 564 years before Mouhot. Going back even further, the temples were built in the 12th century. The people who built them obviously knew they were there. The kings who commissioned them knew. The hundreds of thousands of workers who carved and transported and placed those millions of stone blocks knew. And then, after the urban center depopulated, the monks stayed for 600 years, generation after generation of Buddhist monks maintaining Angkor Wat. living there, praying there, preserving the sacred space. When Da Madalena arrived in 1586, monks showed him around. When Muho arrived in 1860, monks were his guides. The temple had never been abandoned, never forgotten, never lost. So what does it mean to say someone discovered a place that had been continuously inhabited and maintained for centuries? It means, quite simply, that European knowledge was being treated as the only knowledge that mattered. If Europeans didn't know about it, then it wasn't known. Never mind the Cambodian people who'd known about it all along. Never mind the unbroken chain of religious practice. Never mind the written accounts in Portuguese and Chinese. The discovery narrative served a purpose. When France established its colonial protectorate over Cambodia in the 1860s, the story went like this. The French had discovered Angkor and would now restore Cambodia to its former glory. The Cambodians themselves were portrayed as having forgotten their own history, needing European expertise to reconnect with their past. It was a convenient story. It justified French colonial control. It positioned European knowledge as superior. It erased centuries of Cambodian cultural continuity. But it wasn't true. The people of Cambodia never forgot Angkor. The monks never forgot. The cultural memory persisted through the entire period that European scholarship calls the lost centuries. What was actually lost was European awareness, and that's a very different thing. There's a kind of arrogance in the discovery narrative that's worth thinking about. The assumption that something only becomes real, only becomes known, when Western eyes see it and Western pens document it, as if the knowledge held by the people who actually lived there doesn't count. This pattern wasn't unique to Angkor. European explorers discovered the Americas. Despite millions of people already living there, they discovered the source of the Nile, despite local people who could have told them where it was. They discovered archaeological sites across Africa and Asia that local populations had known about for generations. Discovery narratives served empire. They created stories of brave European adventurers, bringing light to dark places. They justified taking control of resources and artifacts, and ultimately, of the places themselves. The correction of these narratives isn't just academic. It's about restoring the historical agency of the people whose knowledge was erased. It's about recognizing that cultural continuity and indigenous knowledge are real and valid, even when they weren't documented in European languages or recognized by European institutions. Muhammad himself probably didn't set out to create a myth. He was a naturalist, exploring a fascinating part of the world. His journals are detailed and thoughtful. He died young, never knowing what would be made of his writings. But the myth that grew up around him wasn't innocent. It served specific purposes, and it persisted for over a century and a half because it was useful to certain narratives about empire and civilization and who has the authority to know and document the world. Today, Angkor Wat stands as it has for centuries, maintained by monks, visited by millions, and revealing new secrets with every technological breakthrough. And as we close our journey through this hidden empire, it's worth reflecting on what Angkor teaches us. As we come to the end of this journey through Angkor, there are some threads worth drawing together, some reflections on what this story of a hidden empire teaches us. There's a profound paradox at the heart of Angkor's story. This civilization was built on violence. Jayavarman II seized power by leaping onto his great-uncle's war elephant and killing him. Yet what he built has become a symbol of peace and spirituality. The world's most visited religious monument, a place where millions come seeking tranquility and wonder, beauty and brutality mixed together in stone. That's very human when you think about it. Our greatest achievements often emerge from our deepest conflicts, not despite them, but somehow intertwined with them. Then there's the lesson about technology and limits. The Khmer built the most sophisticated hydraulic system in the pre-industrial world. They sustained a city of nearly 1 million people in a challenging tropical environment. They created engineering marvels that still impressed modern experts, but they couldn't control the monsoons. They couldn't stop decades of drought or prevent cascading failures when extreme floods hit weakened infrastructure. Brilliance and sophistication weren't enough to overcome environmental variability at that scale. It's a humbling reminder. Technology extends our capabilities. It solves problems. It makes the impossible possible, but it doesn't make us immune to natural forces. Operating on timescales and scales larger than human planning can fully account for. Our modern world faces similar challenges. Cities built around water systems that assume historical climate patterns. Infrastructure optimized for conditions that may be shifting. The parallels are uncomfortable but worth considering. There's also something profound about what remained hidden for so long. For over 150 years, archaeologists studied Angkor using the best methods available. They were careful, systematic, thorough, but they still missed 90% of what was there, hidden beneath the jungle canopy. Then LiDAR came along, seeing through vegetation, revealing entire cities in an instant. What took decades of ground searching appeared on a screen in moments. It makes you wonder what else is hidden, not just in jungles, but in deserts, under oceans, beneath ice. What will the next generation of technology reveal? What are we walking past right now without knowing it's there? The mystery doesn't diminish with knowledge. It deepens. Every answer reveals new questions. Those spiral structures with unknown functions. The 1,800 unique women carved in stone. The temporary towers we know existed only because of post holes. Mysteries within mysteries, even after the city is revealed. And then there's the story of continuity. The monks who never left, who maintained Angkor Wat through 6 centuries of transformation, war, climate stress, and political upheaval. Who were there when Da Madalena visited in 1586? Who were there when Muhat arrived in 1860? Who are there today? That's a different kind of achievement than building monuments. It's the achievement of preservation, of cultural memory, of maintaining connection across generations. Less dramatic than construction, perhaps, but just as important, maybe more so. Because without that continuity, Angkor truly would have been lost. Not physically. The stones would still be there. But the knowledge, the meaning, the connection to the past would have been severed. The monks preserved that connection. They kept the thread unbroken. And because of that, Angkor isn't just a ruin. It's a living sacred space with an uninterrupted history stretching back nearly 900 years. What seemed permanent transformed. The great hydraulic city became smaller settlements and sacred temples. The god-king system evolved into other forms of governance. The empire shifted its center, adapted to new trading patterns, responded to environmental pressures. This wasn't failure. It was what all civilizations do. Change, adapt, transform into something new, while carrying forward what matters most. The empire, as it existed in the 12th century, didn't last forever. Nothing does. But the culture continued. The people continued. The sacred spaces continued. The story continued, even when Western observers thought it had ended. Today, Angkor Wat appears on Cambodia's flag. Millions visit every year. The temple stands as it has for centuries, watched over by monks who continue practices passed down through generations. And modern technology continues revealing new secrets hidden beneath the jungle. The story isn't over. It never really was. It just transformed, like the empire itself. There's something deeply peaceful about that. Not triumph, not tragedy, just the natural flow of human civilization. Building and adapting, creating and transforming, achieving remarkable things while remaining subject to forces larger than ourselves. Angkor teaches us about ambition and limits, about what humans can accomplish and what we can't control, about the difference between physical monuments and cultural continuity, about how things that seem lost can be revealed, about how endings are often transformations. And maybe, as you drift towards sleep tonight, you can carry with you the image of those serene faces on the Bayan Towers, still gazing outward with that slight smile, still watching with half-closed eyes, still present after 800 years, embodying a kind of peace that outlasts empires. The monks continue their morning prayers at Angkor Wat, just as they have for 6 centuries. The stones endure. The mysteries remain. And somewhere beneath the jungle canopy, there may still be secrets waiting for the next technology to reveal them. Sleep well. And when you wake, perhaps you'll see the world a bit differently, with appreciation for what's hidden beneath the surface, with awareness of how things transform, rather than simply end, with understanding that the most important things, knowledge, culture, connection, are preserved not in stone, but in the continuous care of those who maintain them across generations.